Hundreds of migrant children have been moved out of a Texas Border Patrol station after they were found to be living in deplorable conditions. An attorney who visited the facility described what she saw earlier tonight here on this network.
We saw children who were being forced to live in horrendous conditions that no child should ever have to live in. Many children reported that they regularly were forced to sleep on the cement, including infants and toddlers. We saw the children who were dirty, and some of them smelled. We saw their clothes were stained. There was no soap. They were infrequently allowed to brush their teeth, and they were given the same breakfast, same lunch, same dinner day after day. And we're talking about instant foods. We're talking about Kool-Aid. We're talking about frozen burritos. It just is not a way to care for children.
These reports came just days after a Trump administration lawyer attempted to defend those very same unsanitary conditions.
It's within everybody's common understanding that, if you don't have a toothbrush, if you don't have soap, if you don't have a blanket, it's not safe and sanitary. Well, wouldn't everybody agree to that? Do you agree to that?
Well, I think there's fair reason to find that those things may be part of safe and sanitary.
Maybe are a part.
Those are federal judges, Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And with us to talk about it tonight, Anita Kumar, White House correspondent, associate editor for Politico. Elliot Williams, former federal prosecutor who was Deputy Assistant Attorney General and counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, as well as former Assistant Director for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE. Good evening. Welcome to you both. Elliot, I'd like to start with you because of attempts out in the media to normalize this. We're hearing the refrain from the current crowd. This is the same thing that Obama did, / Obama was even more aggressive on this front. Elliot, once and for all, since you were there, what of this is a continuation of Obama policy?
Let me make something abundantly clear. The Obama administration never had a policy of deliberately separating parents from their children as a means of deterring people from coming to the United States, period. And that's the thing, and I think what's getting lost in this is, the mere fact that if children were ever separated from their parents, it was incidental, and immediately they were reunited with or at least the intent was to reunite them with their parents or their families. There was never a goal, and the administration now, the Trump administration, has stated we intended to deter people from coming to the United States with the fear that your toddlers will be taken away from you. That is certainly sinister, to say the least. And I think it's a means of distancing themselves from the true intent of the approach that they're taking here. But again, what this all exposes is what we need to be having is a bigger, broader, comprehensive conversation about how we ensure orderly access to the United States via the immigration system, how we ensure safe and orderly removal from the United States, as to people who ought not to be here, but also how we fix the conditions, the horrific conditions, frankly, throughout parts of the hemisphere that have led to the mess down at the border. And we're not having that critical, and it needs to be had with Congress, it needs to be had with the public and with the White House and the administration. But I think we're getting into the weeds of a lot of these particular issues. But what we need to be having is how do we humanely treat our immigration system, and I think that's getting lost in this whole discussion.
Anita, I want to share with our audience what some of this normalization sounds like. Here's the president with Chuck Todd. We'll discuss it on the other side.
I ended separation. I inherited separation from President Obama. President Obama built, they call them jail cells. They were built.
Let's talk about what's happening now. Your administration, you're not doing the recreation, you're not even schooling these kids anymore. You've gotten rid of all that stuff.
We're doing a fantastic job under the circumstances. The Democrats aren't even approving giving us money. Where is the money?
Anita, is any of that going to get traction that this is because of Democrats?
Well, that's been the president's talking point, right? He has been blaming Democrats and trying to pressure them, saying that it's their fault and they have to fix it. He did give them 2 weeks. Hey
there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.